Okay, we're going to go straight into our next session. This session is all about metrics and methodology, and it's not just for nerds, as I've been reminded, but actually, I mean, we are all a bit nerdish, aren't we? So we like the stuff, we like the metrics, we like the measuring stuff. But let's think about what we should be measuring in this time, what we should be measuring into the future. Jacob Malamos is going to be is he chairing this? Yes, Jacob is chairing this. My apologies. And Emily Bracken is with him from Daryl Upsall International. I'm sure you know Emily. And then Roland Saki from WWF is going to be joining this panel as well. So we're going to head off. I've seen a Croatian. Matija is in the chat box as well. So we're all across Europe at the moment. So Team America, come on, give us a shout. Or have you got bigger fish to fry? You've got other things to keep your eye on. I don't know. I'm going to be back after this session, and we will chat then. But let's head on over and let's talk about metrics and methodology.
Welcome to this sessions on metrics and methodology. I'll quickly run through our agenda, but also I'd like to say thank you very much to Emily Bracken and from Daryl Upsall and Roland Saki from WWF for joining us on this session.
Thanks very much for having me, Jacob. I'm really happy to be part of this. I'm the CEO of the consulting practice at Daryl Upsall International. I've been working for the last 10 years in the fundraising sector and specifically at growth and investment strategies for organizations, as well as how to optimize results and how to look to improve and grow to reach a good level of sustainability for organizations.
Brilliant. And why are you passionate about face-to-face?
I was going to say the last point, true. Really, I think that face-to-face is an excellent way. It's the ideal way to connect with new supporters. Of course, we see that is it's a major engine of growth, but I think this topic is really important because it's only as good as you make it, right? And it takes that analysis to actually make face-to-face work for you. So I think it's an excellent tool, but of course has to be managed quite carefully.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emily. Roland, quick introduction for you.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm Roland Saki from WWF International. Physically, I'm in Budapest, Hungary. And already at 14 years at WWF, it's a long time, but it was a great time doing fundraising development in a big number of countries from Latin America and Europe all over to Asia. And face-to-face is because more than half of our fundraising, despite all the digital age, is still face-to-face. And I think the future is still there in face-to-face because people ultimately seek human interactions, maybe with a bit more digital in there, but ultimately still in person.
Oh, brilliant. Yes, absolutely. All right. And I'm Jacob. I'm sitting in Copenhagen, enjoying life here in the fall, sneaking up and winter slowly approaching. I'm a founder of two companies, Zoe.agency, which is a benchmarking tool, and the other is a fundraising and fundraising intelligence company. So I'm really passionate about KPIs, measuring, and doing it more scientifically. And for passion, I started doing face-to-face. So that's where I come from, and my career has developed from there. And it's just a wonderful way of engaging with people in the street and where else we can find them. Brilliant. So that's a quick introduction, and there's a few hundred people out there watching. Hello to you guys again. I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. So to kick everything off on categorization of KPIs, I would like to hand it over to Roland to take us through some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think the most important, if we talk about KPIs, is define what we actually want to measure and why. Because there are a big number of KPIs and all do a certain job for you. But if you don't know what you want to measure, it's going to be ultimately very hard to find the right one. I once heard a very funny joke. It's maybe silly, but it does say that three people are shooting at a target and one shoots to the far left and the other one shoots to the far right and the third one says, oh, in average, we're all on bullseye.
Yes.
Not sure. Okay, joke aside. The point is that there are different data that you work with, and the most important is to categorize what we measure it for. There are four main categories or purposes we analyze data. The easy one is the generic data that you can collect, and you take it as you collect it, like the number of your active donors, your acquisition volume, how many people you acquired last month, what was your revenue and cost in the last month, and what ultimately, the most important one, what is your net revenue from the last month or last year? And then the tricks start, because this is what you can just take from your database, but then everything else you need to measure. For example, there's traffic and conversion, which talks about acquisition, basically, like sign up per day, a famous one for face-to-face fundraisers, website conversion rates for online fundraisers, and the same thing for pledge fulfillment rate. It means how many signups ultimately turn into completed donations. The third category is about profit, which we usually do measure on an individual donor. So we check out whether the operation itself is profitable. So we check the cost of the acquisition. We check the average donation and the net donor value. And then we can check out the net donor value on one person. But then it doesn't really say anything for your upper management, because they don't want to know how much money you get from one donor, but they want to know how the investment is going, whether what we invest today is going to generate profit next year. So the last category is the investment. There's the famous ROI, which is often mixed up with ROE. So just to make the difference, ROI is our return on the investment, but the other one is return on the expenses. And the third one that is also very important is the time to break even. So if I invest today, I'm going to have a negative cash flow for 1 year or 2 or 3, but when it turns into positive, when I can give back to my organization saying, hey, this is the money that I can give you, and this goes into our mission, nature conservation, children, medical aid, humanitarian aid, or else. And that's important because different stakeholders need different information. If you speak to your fellow fundraisers, you probably talk a lot about conversion rates and traffic. If you talk to your manager, you probably speak about profitability. But if you talk to the board of your organization, all they want to know is, so when you talk to your board, all they want to know is the future of the investment. So always choose your KPIs according to your audience. But then there's a further point that's funny. There's not a single word that has an absolute meaning in our a lovely word. If I say churn, you probably mean something, but is it the same definition you are using for churn? If I say attrition, what do you mean? Is attrition and churn the same thing? Ultimately, it is supposed to be. But the same funny collision is between no-show in some markets and then pre-debit attrition in the other one. Is it really the same thing, or you measure something different? I had conversations inside WWF, inside our organization, when one of our countries says, oh, we are so great. Our retention is so good. We've got 95% retention rate. So good, so good. And then the other country says, oh, you see, I look at this country A and their retention rate is so good. They're at 95 and I'm only 80. So how do you measure it? So you give me their meaning, we check on the other one, and we find out that ultimately their attrition rates are similar, exactly similar, just because one is using only cancellations as a dropout. The other one also uses all kind of non-payment for dropout. So when you equal out the definitions, the winner might turn into the loser and the loser into the winner. Basically, the message is you have to be absolutely precise. You use the same definition for your KPIs before you start benchmarking with anybody else.
Yeah, you know, Roland, I think your last point is so incredibly important around definitions and how this underscores the importance of really clear definitions. And I think that a lot of organizations don't yet have clear definitions and have this level of misunderstanding, like you say, within an organization as well as across organizations. When we've looked at it, when we've looked at comparing how are these different factors calculated across different organizations, there can be a really wide range in how is a cost per acquisition created, right? Let alone attrition, which, as Jacob mentioned, we'll get into later. I was curious if you could also explain what I don't see on here is any kind of look at exact timeframes. How long do you say it's most important to say in terms of looking at the maybe return on expenses then, or your time to break even? Do you have kind of different timeframes in mind for these metrics?
Okay. That's an interesting question, the time frame we measure. And I think for ROI, the answer is easier probably, because you can have an annual ROI, you can have a 3 and 5 year. These are mostly what we check. My funny one is donor lifetime value and other metrics, right? Because how long you measure that? I mean, as long as the donor is alive, there's still a chance to give more. So the donor lifetime value is a self-created contradiction in itself. Therefore, we also limit the donor lifetime value to, for example, 5 years. So it's actually 5-year donor value instead of lifetime value, because we can't wait forever to tell.
Yeah, great. I agree with you completely. And that's exactly how I often work with organizations to narrow it down as well, right? If you try and say, or in that way, lifetime value, maybe is lifetime value, but then that's a really different calculation, and you're talking about something maybe going outside of face-to-face and with a lot of different levels of uncertainty. Whereas these other areas, such as net donor value, you can easily and rightly cap at 3 or 5 years and say, what is the value within this time frame? Even if, yes, you want the donor to keep going.
There is an even more funny context to that one, and that's about calendar year or lifetime year. Even today, we do have conflicts or like debates where somebody comes to me and says, my in-the-year income. And I'm saying, what do you mean by in-the-year income? It means like this year, this calendar year. Okay, so that means you acquire a donor in 2020 and you measure how much money you acquire from, you get from the donor in 2020. There's just a slight problem with that. Donors acquired in January have a year to give you more, and donors acquired at Christmas only have a couple of days, so they can't really repeat it. So transferring your thinking from calendar year, which is fine for bookkeeping, yeah, but not good for profit, you have to transfer that into lifetime thinking. It means 1 year income from the sign up of the donor, whatever the sign up was.
That's a huge important point there, Roland, because that's what is speaking. Is it the financial year? Is it the liquidity of the organization? Or is it actually the profitability of the program and the donors? Because ideally, following the bookkeeping, we should only do face-to-face in January.
Yes, and that's back to the point that you need to identify your audience. Are you talking to your finance director? Choose your KPIs. Are you talking to your fundraising director? Choose your KPIs. Or are you talking to the board, which doesn't even care with the in the year at all? Again. And then the third point, what if I talk to my vendor, to my agency, which does have its own KPIs? So how match it? It's always about the audience.
Absolutely. Keeping that straight when you're looking at the broad range of KPIs you can work with is a very important point. I think we'll move on to Emily here, because there's some of these elements on calculation and time and focus that we would like to bring in here to get back to some of the really hardcore basics there. Emily, would you take us on that trip?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is when talking about kind of going back to basics, it's really because not because this is what's new and exciting in the sector, but because in my work with organizations, I see that still too many of us are using, a bit, Roland, as you mentioned, different definitions and are calculating things in different ways. And in some ways, it's okay to just set your definition and that can be clear enough. But there's a few key areas where I think we can really calculate it incorrectly so that we're not actually looking at the results. And the two areas that I want to bring up are attrition, as well as across, again, these really key indicators that Roland brought up of ROI, and net donor value. Attrition, that is where I would argue that actually when you're talking kind of overall churn rate across the entire database, that's a really different indicator. And if you want to look at how you're retaining or how much your donors are attriting from face-to-face, which we all know is a really key factor in profitability, it has to be calculated by cohort, right? So exactly as we were digging into, not on an annual scale of, look, it's January of 2021, how many donors are left from 2020? There's still 95%, so that's great. Even though I recruited most of them in November and December, right? You'd actually need 13 months to figure out your first 12-month attrition in order to start and say, okay, of the donors recruited in January, how many are still giving after 12 full months? How many have actually given payments across that entire time period? And so that monthly attrition is really important. And I would also encourage you to look at even the differences across different areas, maybe across different suppliers, in-house versus external. But again, by cohort and at least monthly over, I would say at least the first 18 months, but longer as possible. And don't wait until the 4th month to start looking, and then only look at, say, 4 and 12 months. And so again, don't group them all together. But those are still kind of really key areas that I see organizations doing. And I get it's a lot of extra work, and it takes a good back end to actually track your donors and to know how the attrition is progressing month after month. But that is really the key to having a good return on investment in face-to-face. So I think it's a really key factor to continue looking at. And then I want to highlight, maybe I guess from everything that Roland brought up before, some of the really key areas are these comprehensive metrics that bring together your return on investment and the net donor value. The difference here too, I would actually bring attrition or expected attrition into these calculations, because that can show a big difference in terms of quality. And I don't want to put that squarely in terms of a supplier is better or worse, or how the organization is managing donors, right? Of course, it's a combination of these factors, but it's such an important and critical metric that by looking at your expected return, by including attrition in it, you can help to look at where you should place your investment across different areas, depending on what you would expect, right? So maybe that's depending on the attrition in the first few months that you've gotten across different suppliers, across different donor development campaigns that you've developed in the first couple months for your donors that are coming in. And then look at this, look at it in this comprehensive way.
Yeah, but the question is, what is success at all? Is success the number of kilometers you can do, or is it the fastest speed you can do? Is it the shortest time to get to the destination? Same thing in our investment. What do you want? Is it high return on investment? Is it the highest maximum volume of profit you want? Right? Because the two will not go together. Or is it the smallest investment possible to make? That also will not make you the highest profit. So I think the number one question is what your manager wants from you. What do you need to achieve? And then you start measuring.
Yes, it almost becomes existential when you have to ask the big why to start with. What are we doing with this program? And what are we trying to achieve with the resources we have? But I think this naturally leads into another issue about maybe a vanity metric we have in some organizations about volume of recruitment. And I don't know, Emily, you have some insights on this.
I was going to say that drum roll sounds like my next slide being queued up perfectly. So yeah, I think it's exactly the point, right? What really are we trying to achieve with face-to-face? And I think it's just It's just too common that we're looking at volumes, right? We end up, and I get that comes from above, right? We have targets that are based on how many donors we need to have in 2020 or in 2021. And therefore we need to recruit so many donors in order to reach that level of donors. And if our attrition starts going up, then what do? Well, then we recruit more donors. And then, so what do? We hire agencies that are going to give us so many donors. And a good agency, therefore, is an agency that gives us all of the donors that we ask for. And a bad agency is one that doesn't, right? And this is how the cycle of measurements goes. And I would say that, maybe not entirely, but for the most part, we should just forget volume, right? That is not what most of us are trying to get out of our face-to-face programs, right? We're trying to get a net return that will support our end missions. And I get that there are some exceptions to this when you really want supporters that actually for your advocacy work are important to the cause and different areas. But for the most part, in face-to-face, this is about getting a net return from regular and unrestricted income coming from monthly donors that we're recruiting on the street. Of course, with certain exceptions to that. And therefore, the actual volume of donors doesn't matter as what those donors are bringing. You don't know if you want the volume if you don't know if those are actually donors that you want or not, right? Are they donors that will stick around? Are they donors that were told at the point of sign up that you can give for a couple months and then just drop it and it's no big deal, right? Were they pushed into it and therefore they're likely to not stick with the organization? And so I think the solution to that also is about what we're measuring, right? That's actually not an issue so much with face-to-face and being on the street as how we're managing the programs and what we're looking at from them. I get there has to be some measurement of volumes, but that shouldn't be the end objective. It should be what, Roland, you were just saying a second ago, is the return on investment, right? Is what's the net that's actually coming back to donors.
I absolutely agree. The ultimate profit is the ultimate goal of fundraising is the profit. Bad word because it's coming from business, so we translate it as net revenue, but it ultimately means the same thing. How much money I as a fundraiser can give to our mission, children, nature, humanitarian causes, whatever. So if you look for that, what you need to measure is what is the donor that gives me the largest net profit. And sometimes the volume plays a role in the ultimate amount of net profit we can generate, but it goes through quality, right? Because you always start with the best donor you can get and you go next until you reach the point where there's no more net revenue from the donor. That's where you need to stop, right? But one single highest quality donor is only quality, but it's not money that my executive director wants. It's only pocket money, right? So volume, I'm sorry, Emily, contradicting you. At some point, volume is important, but volume isn't more important than net revenue.
Absolutely brilliant. Emily, a comment on that, and then.
Yeah, and I think I'll just to support that. I think one of the reasons that face-to-face is such an excellent channel is because you can get volumes, right? Because I look across a lot of different channels and where can organizations invest across the market to get, let's say, just even in unrestricted income. And face-to-face can be reliable, it can be predictable, and it can bring big volumes, which is important. I absolutely agree with you. It's just that there has to be the measurement around it.
And I think this point and part of the session is also inspiring you guys out there listening in on this to take some of these discussions with you back home to your own organization and enable some of these really important and relevant discussions about how do we measure our program and how are we working with this, and that we can't take any KPI for granted. We have to make sure we're doing the right ones. And as Roland said earlier, we have to define the top level goals of what we are trying to achieve. And I think I'll move on a step further to another element that I find incredibly interesting when working with these programs is the difference between a lead and a lag indicator. And this will kind of enrich the discussions you have a little bit back home in the office. And it's about being proactive, because a lot of the figures and the KPIs we've been speaking about is something you end up with at the end of the year or at the end of the month. And if you want to be proactive, you have to go out and find some indicators as well that can show you the lead into achieving those goals. And the example I've brought along is a good leading indicator on safety in a work environment is how many people are wearing their hats, because that has a correlation with how many safety incidents there actually exists. But if you're only measuring how many accidents we have, it's very hard to be proactive and do something before the end of the year. And therefore we have to be more proactive. And for me, the figures I've looked into on face-to-face is really clearly measuring the whole non-fulfillment donors. So the people no shows, they have many names, but the first gift given that isn't given, because they have a tendency to show something about the quality and lifetime value of the program and the donors. So be sure that you're measuring things that can enable you to be proactive on your program as well. And I think while we're on this, and we haven't touched upon a specific KPIs or numbers in itself, but I can imagine there's a few people out there in the audience sitting and saying, our return on investment is 3 years. Is that high or is that low? I think you guys have the most extensive experience across different markets. Without disclosing something really specific, could you maybe just talk through some of the rule of thumb, or what's a good case on face-to-face recruitment on some of the top level KPIs?
That's a hard question, right? Because there are so many regional differences between the continents. But if you want something as a thumb rule, I think for face-to-face and a new investment, for us, the break-even is supposed to happen in the third year, around the third year. If it's much longer than that, then there is a profitability problem. If I get a proposal for face-to-face investment that supposes break-even in the second year, then I say it's not proper planning. Something is missing.
That was nice and tight to the point. Absolutely, that makes sense. What about you?
You know, I wouldn't. I'll to skirt around it a bit, right? Because I think it goes back to the idea that we calculate these things very differently, right? And exactly what you include in your return on investment or your net donor value can be very different. Are you including donor care costs? Are you including direct costs or indirect costs? But I would say using more basic metrics and globally speaking, I think the absolute worst. So I see that attrition, let's say, and retention percentages vary much more by market than they do by program, right? There will always be a bigger difference between, let's say, the United States and Japan than there are within different organizations in Japan or within different organizations in the US, right? You're not going to achieve results in those kind of markets that are similar. But I think globally speaking, for face-to-face, the best retention levels that I'm seeing are, let's say, 80%, at most maybe 85% in the first year, in good markets, right? You won't get that in certain markets that are really competitive. And let's say at the really bottom is around 50% in some of the poorer performing markets. I'd say that getting to at least 75 to 80% of 12-month retention will make a big difference. And that, I think, is the key factor in profitability. Again, you're probably not going to get to 85% retention in the US, and you should never get down to 70% retention in Japan, right? But that is the key factor. I also think in terms of costs, looking at only direct costs, you should be aiming for, I guess then it depends on if you're including VAT or not, but aiming for within 12 to 14 months donation is ideal, just in terms of pure cost, right? And then of course there's indirect costs on top of that. you would want to factor in retention in order to look at your break even, and there's probably be some value added tax on top of it. But I still see that's possible. But again, that varies very much by market.
What's funny in your question is actually that we gave you answers and it sounded like definite answers, but again, we didn't add the definitions we used for it. So when I spoke about break-even point, did I mean the break-even year, which means the first year with a positive cash flow, or did I mean the year when the complete investment has been repaid? That's a huge difference. Or Emily has been talking about attrition. So which attrition definition we use when we say a country's up at 85, or it's only 55, because sometimes the 55 and the 85 might mean the same thing if you equalize the calculation, right? And none of it is a wrong calculation. It's just a different one. And we're back to the point, do we talk about profitability of the program, or do we talk about the financial management of the program? One is talking to the fundraisers, and there you talk about performance in so-called lifetime months or lifetime years, starting by the sign up, and then see how the donor performs in 1 year, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if we talk about investment, the game changes, because everybody wants to know what is going to be the investment money in, money out from our pocket in year 1, which means 2020 or whatever is your fiscal year. And what is our cash out or cash in the next year and the year after? So in that game, you're immediately into the calendar year game. Now your problem is that you're calculating your profitability on a lifetime base, and you talk to your finance managers in a financial or calendar year base. So you have to harmonize those two things, and you need to know which one you talk about. And this is the funny one. I'm not sure I heard it from Chris Chalka, who it was. Somebody said, oh, I know who it was. So he said, if your KPIs are all comprehending each other, so numbers fully harmonized, you probably are totally wrong. Numbers not always add up to 0, because this fact that some KPIs you measure for calendar year, some others you measure for lifetime year, and that are not compatible to each other. You need to be able to explain the differences, but the differences must be there, otherwise something is measured wrong. Do we confuse everybody now at this stage?
I love it's an excellent point. I'll paraphrase a little bit, and you can see if I'm on the right track or the right page here. But the idea is that when we look at our KPIs, or we look at financial versus program revenue, or whatever the figure is, those two won't equate and make up the same number. They will be different. And I think you're nodding, so I'll just continue 2 seconds on that. I think that's a really crucial and interesting question here in the talk about KPIs on accuracy, because as part of some of the consultancy jobs I've done, I've sometimes met clients who said, well, if we don't get 100% accurate metric or figure, we can't really use it. And I'm an entrepreneur, so sometimes I'm operating within 80% accuracy, and it's still a trend and information that I can use on taking decisions and running programs.
I give you a very simple example why 100% accuracy is not possible. Okay, so when you do face-to-face, the sign-up counts when the sign-up happened, right? When you physically get that signature on the street, yeah? If you talk about donors, the donation is counted in the month the money was collected, right? If I get a donation on the 1st of January from a donor who signed up on the 29th of December, okay? It's after Christmas, fundraisers are still working because they have to complete their month, get to their targets, and one guy gets a donor on the 29th, gets a sign up on the 29th, but the office is not working, so the processing happens in January. The first donation is taken in January. What happens? This is a sign up for December. It means last year. This is a donor and donation income of the next year, right? Does it match? No, and it will never be. right? The same thing you have between every single month. That is immediately a problem. But if you know this is going to happen, this is talking for about 2 or 3% differences in my numbers, you're safe. If it's bigger difference, something else in there, but it won't be zero, never. We got all silent.
I will add, I think that just again underscores again and again the importance of having a really good back office system that can track everything really well so that you can look at your information in an informed way and decide and make decisions really based on the right inputs. But I think a lot of this also brings up when you're looking at, how things are coming through, and do you go for 100% accuracy or 80% accuracy? In the end, numbers are telling us, you can look at them in many ways, right? There isn't just one story coming out of the numbers. And I don't mean this in a negative way, like, hey, you can just manipulate your data, right? But a lot of times it takes looking at your data and figuring out what it's telling you and pulling out the points that are actually speaking to what you need to know. And therefore, there is, of course, a story within data that comes through. And so the idea that numbers are 100% accurate, well, 2 + 2 is 4, yes, but where does that income come in, right? Does it come in as income in December or in January? Well, either one can be fine. It depends on what story you need to learn from that.
Wonderful, I like it. I learned something from our session. But you're absolutely right. The more we can save, it's always easier to save on the donor and maximize the income than get a new one and a new one to replace the falling out ones.
Which is especially key in face-to-face, where when we talk about the competition across channels, that's the weak point of face-to-face all too often, right? Is that there's relatively the least loyal donors. So what you can do to improve that, absolutely. I think it's a really important point. And that is it, right? That's going to be your best return on investment. Always is not on recruiting new donors, but on keeping your current donors.
Yeah, it's the get, keep, and grow. That's the important bit. Absolutely. Good. So this has been some of the stuff we wanted to share with you and the audience about KPIs, metrics, and methodology. And as you can see, it's a conversation we could continue with for a long time. And actually, the first step is sitting down and getting those definitions right, and then defining your top-level goal to move you in the right direction as an organization. So to wrap up, I'd like to invite Roland and Emily, just a small comment or something for the audience, and then we'll wrap up for this session. And afterwards, some of us will be there for Q&A. So please, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to write them in the chat function.
KPIs are fun. Take your fun in calculating them, but never lose the final objective from the sight when you do it.
I would support that. This is the most critical area to success in your face-to-face program. If you don't know what you're doing or how well you're doing, you don't know how much and how to improve it, how much to put into it. So I just would re-emphasize how important this is, having good data and good understanding as to what's happening, measuring it in the right way. And I agree with Roland, it's fun. The numbers can tell you a lot, right? A picture tells 1,000 words. I think numbers do as well.
Brilliant. In Denmark, we have a saying, you become what you eat. And same thing goes for you become what you measure. So be aware what you're measuring at and what you're trying to achieve. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you to the Q&A session.